everyone. I'm Eric. My name is Eric Lang, and this is actually called Eric Lang's Board Game Extravaganza. I did not name that. So I'm here to talk to you guys about board games. I'm assuming and hoping that most of you guys are here to hear about board games. So there's a number of things I can talk about, but generally I try to run panels like this as close to 100% Q&A as possible, because really I'm here to answer questions that you're interested in hearing. So I'll talk a little bit about my history, what I've done in board gaming, and I have a couple of little talking points, but mostly what they are is just springboards for ideas for you guys to ask questions about. And it's not to say you have to follow those, just to give you guys some ideas. So I've been, before I start, I just want to ask some questions about you guys. So how many guys here, how many guys identify as board game players, like board gamers? Most of you? Almost everybody? Awesome. How many guys would say own more than 10 different board games in their collection? That's awesome. The rest of you have some work to do. So how many guys of you bought a board game in the last year? Last month? Today? You guys get to ask all the questions you want. So I've been doing this for the last, I just found out, 15 years professional. I've been designing games for Fantasy Flight Games, which they're the company I've worked with the most. I've designed most of their living card games, Game of Thrones, Call of Cthulhu, Warhammer Invasion, Star Wars. I've done a bunch of board games with them as well, both in design and development capacity. I designed Chaos in the Old World for them most recently, which is a big evil board game based on Warhammer Fantasy. I've done development work on Battlestar Galactica, Game of Thrones, the board game, World of Warcraft, Warhammer I almost said. World of Warcraft, the board game, that gigantic big boss game from way back when. I've done work for Mattel, for Hasbro, for Spin Masters, for Wizards of the Coast on their collectible card games. I've done work for WizKids, most recently on Couriers, the dice building game, little candy-colored dice. I have a brand new game from WizKids coming out. It's so brand new, it's not even available yet, called Trains and Stations. I put it up here. It's the newest one. I'm going to be doing demos of this in the board game room 718, I believe it is. Yep. Anybody wants to come by and learn how to play. The only thing we can't do is walk out with it because it's not available for the next couple of months. This is the one that's most fresh in my mind, so I can have, want to talk about the process or technical questions. That's the one that's easiest for me to talk about. Got a little mystery game here. It's one of my famous blue box prototypes. Blue box I got from my co-designer, Mike Elliott, who showed me the coolest way to pack as much game stuff in here. It usually contains 3 or 4 games at once. This is just one. There's a pre-press copy of a brand new game coming out that called Generation Hex, a little Euro game that's from a company called Third World Studios that will be going on Kickstarter, hopefully later this year. I'm currently working with Cool Mini or Not on a bunch of the Kickstarter games. I'm sure you guys have, hopefully you guys have heard of them. They do all the big Kickstarter games like Zombicide and Sedition Wars. We just finished Chaos Ball, which is a bloody sports game that's a little faster and easier to play. That was mine. We just Kickstarted that a couple months ago. I've got 2 more games coming out with them between now and the end of 2015. Let's see, and a lot of stuff I can't talk about. So just assume 3 or 4 really cool, awesome games that have cool titles. I can tell you what the code names are, and then maybe this time next year I can talk more about them. So things I want to talk about very, very briefly, and if you guys give you guys ideas for questions. Again, you don't have to follow this at all. If you have your own questions, please ask. I'm happy to answer. Just make sure they're about board games, please. Board games, by the way, being board games, card games, miniature games, anything but role-playing games. I play role-playing games, I just haven't published any professionally, so I don't have a lot of deep insight into the publishing side. Except that it's really, really hard, and I'm glad I don't do it. We can talk a little bit about board game history. I'm not quite a scholarly academic, but I've played board games for a long, long time. I've studied board games for a long time. So we can talk about like the rise of the German style board game, designer games, what the difference between Euro games and Ameritrash games, which is a title. Those are a lot of the games I work on. I like that. I actually quite like that title, but like cool games where you interact, with tons and tons of interaction and sometimes a fair amount of violence. The rise of cooperative games, rise of hybrid game design, which is old school American style Risk, A&A style thematic game design mixed with Euro game discipline. You've seen a lot of those lately, especially from Fantasy Flight Games. Modernizing games, I've actually started to work on a couple of games, which unfortunately I can't talk about, but I can talk about the process. Games where we take, projects where we take old classic games from the 70s or 80s and modernize them. One of the most famous examples is Cosmic Encounter from Eon Games way back in the late 70s. That was just, a new edition was just put out by Fantasy Flight 3 years ago. Fantastic edition, by the way, highly recommended game. I'm going to recommend a lot of games to you guys as well, because games that I think are awesome. They're not mine. They're play my games, of course, but I should play lots and lots of different games. And of course, I'll talk a little bit about Kickstarter, but Kickstarter is a cool subject, and it tends to overtake panels sometimes. So I'll try to keep the Kickstarter questions to minimum if we can. But I'm happy to talk about like how Kickstarter has changed game design. But rather than just me sitting here and talking, I'm happy to answer some questions. Probably what I'm going to do is I'll go clockwise from here, and if I miss you a couple of times, you can just like jazz hands and I'll find you. Do you want to start with some questions? Starting right there, sir.
I have a question on mechanics.
Mechanics?
Yes. As there are various target audiences in terms of the new players. And
I'm sorry, I might have to ask you to start over because I just lost you from the door open there.
Oh, okay. My question is basically what types of mechanics work for the different audiences, like new players, like if you want to make a pop game like Ticket to Ride or Monopoly, something like that, versus what's for hardcore gamers. And, are there really any different types of mechanics that are used based on who you're targeting?
Okay, it's a good question. So the question was, just for anybody who missed it, what kind of mechanics suit what different types of audiences, from casual to hardcore, young, old, we even split more male, female, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a great question, and I don't necessarily think about it in terms of which mechanics suit which audiences. But before I do that, let me first define mechanics. So all games have mechanics, right? On your turn, you roll a die and move that many spaces is a mechanic. On your turn, during the game, we're going to auction off for different pieces, spending our money. That's a mechanic. Thank you, sir. When your character dies, you lose the game is a mechanic. So what kind of mechanics work for what? I don't necessarily think of mechanics in isolation as being good for certain types of audiences. But in terms of how many mechanics or what mix of mechanics tends to work. So for example, the obvious answer is from young to old, right? Games for young players, you probably don't want to put a whole bunch of different mechanics in, right? So Uno is a great example. Uno is, the mechanic is crazy eights. If you know crazy eights, that's the mechanic. You want to be you want to be the first one to discard your hand, but and not be left with a ton of cards left in your hand. That's nice and simple. Everybody gets it. It's based on something they already know. Whereas a game like Twilight Imperium from Fantasy Flight, anybody play more than once? It's a cool game. I like the game. It's really hard to play. It takes 8 hours, and it has a ton of different mechanics in it. If you go on the site BoardGameGeek.com, which by the way I highly, highly recommend, and search for games by mechanics, you can probably find almost every mechanic in that game. Titan is another good one from Valley Games, was just reprinted. It uses almost every mechanic in the book. so generally the younger, the fewer mechanics you want to have, but it's, I generally try to shy away from auction type mechanics or what I call group think mechanics. So any mechanic that requires.
Sorry, I missed that last.
I try to shy away from, is this thing on?
Yep, it's working.
All right. I try to shy away from auction type mechanics or what I call group think mechanics. Mechanics that require the entire table to get together and evaluate something. So we're going to run an auction for this gold crown, which has the number 1 on it. Everybody's going to bid for it. That's the very, very basics of auction. But those kind of mechanics require everybody at the table to collectively decide on what the value of a component is going to be. Generally, sometimes, especially when you're learning the game, without knowing all the strategy of the game. That tends to be very, very intimidating for casual players, people that don't like to play games, that don't identify themselves as hardcore gamers, and don't identify themselves winning a game being the most important part of the game. I'm not one of those, unless of course I'm playing Magic the Gathering. That's a whole other story. Party game mechanics, like mechanics that don't necessarily result in win or loss conditions. So like, everybody, I'm going to use an example here. There's a fantastic party game from Richard Garfield called What Were You Thinking? This is a recommendation, by the way, if you can find it. It's a great party game. It's a trivia game where the correct answer doesn't matter at all. Somebody asks a trivia question, and then everybody secretly writes down an answer, and you get points for everybody whose answer you match, not necessarily the correct answer. So those kind of mechanics are great for party games because they're not about solving a puzzle or optimizing resources in order to beat other players. They're about getting to know players better, or the person who wins has a better knowledge of, has a better understanding or better intuitive knowledge of the people around them. Worst case scenario, those kind of games, if you lose, you get to learn more about the people that you're playing with. So that was a long way of saying, I don't think of mechanics discretely as for a target audience. Any other questions? That spawned a bunch. So I'll come back to you guys. We're just going to continue going clockwise. We got one over here.
What do you think about expansions? Like I've noticed for like something like Settlers or Dominion, they're always coming out with more and more expansions, and I find that I'd rather just buy a new game than continuing on with, like, I mean, I'd rather just play straight up Settlers than playing all the different, and they keep coming up with more. Do you think it's better to, for companies to just keep creating new games, or do you think it's smart for them to keep creating these expansions?
Another good question. Just in case anybody missed it, the question is, what do you think for expansions? Should companies continue making expansions for existing games or just make new games? So there's two perspectives. There's one is a game player and one is as a professional who's working for companies. So for company, the answer is almost always we want to make expansions because most companies that you know of that are big in the game industry are built on everything, right? A title that keeps selling over and over and over and over again. There's two ways that those titles can keep selling, like Monopoly. They just keep making different versions of it, right? And they're also gifting games, right? They're way beyond people just buying it for themselves to play. They buy it because it's the game they know as a gift for somebody else because they don't know anything else. They don't know any other titles. And there's expansions, like you said, for Settlers Catan, for Dominion, for living card games that I worked on. They change enough of the basic game to allow people to play the same game without having to learn a new set of rules, but refresh the game, right? Refresh it by adding a new wrinkle here, a new twist there. Elements that you thought weren't important before are now important. Dominion, by the way, is anybody familiar with Dominion? Dominion deck building game. If you are not, I highly, highly recommend it. It's really cool. It should be, every one of these games I'm talking about should be for sale downstairs, and I have no profit share in it, profit stake in any of these. I'm in fact going to go buy some after we talk. So from a sales perspective, expansions are almost always the way to go. Every new game is a risk. You don't know whether people are going to like it or not. Even if it's by a named designer, there's always a chance it could be a miss. As a player, I like both, right? I like there are times when we're playing that we don't want to learn a new game, right? We just want to sit and enjoy games we already know. And if it's a game that we've been playing forever, of course, I want to maybe want to try adding an expansion into it. Maybe not as fast as they're releasing it, but like for Settlers is actually a really good example. I also prefer Settlers just on its own with up to 4 people. Like even the 5-6 player expansion, I have a little bit of trouble with, but I have many gaming groups that swear by it. Like that say that, or Cities and Knights that say we'll never ever play Settlers without Cities and Knights.
Oh, I see.
So the games that, like for example, Fantasy Flight, some games that sometimes they release expansions to fix. I'm going to use make sure to use air quotes here, but to fix issues with the base game or to improve the base game experience. Shattered Empires, for example, for Twilight Imperium, many of the core fans consider Shattered Empires to be they consider Shattered Empires plus Twilight Imperium to be the real game experience. They'll never go back to the vanilla game. I hope that helped. That was a lot of answers. Question for you.
How do you manage balancing the differences in strategic gameplay as opposed to the sort of chance and spontaneity in the game? And which do you think is more important to the fun of a game?
What is more important, luck or skill? That's a great question. I actually ran several panels on, that's a panel topic all on its own. Personally, I believe both are important. I personally don't like games of pure skill, and of course I don't like games of pure chance. Again, it is a demographic question. Who's your target audience? There are people who identify as skill game players who only want skill to matter. Those are the guys you'll find in the chess club at school, right? They don't have a high tolerance for chance. Of course, skill for them, but inside our hobby here, the lifestyle hobby of board games, I'm finding increasingly that people have less tolerance for pure skill. I like to have a healthy degree of luck, and I don't really want to put a number on it, but if you put a gun to my head, I would say I'd say 65-35, 65% skill, 35% luck, right? And it's almost meaningless to say, because what does that actually mean? So in a strategy game, the better player on an even field, both players with an even amount of knowledge of the game, the better player should beat the worst player about 65% of the time to be a successful hobby game. What that allows is that even if two players are, even if somebody's better than somebody else, the worst player still has a chance of winning. What luck does also is it protects ego. So we all have ego coming into a game, right? We all have it. We all come into the game with a personal investment. I'm going to win. I'm going to show that I'm smarter than you. I'm going to show that I'm better than you. I can politic better than you, et cetera, et cetera. So if I lose, I don't want it to be 100% my fault. I want something else to be able to blame it on. So this is a pretty common psychological condition, right? So if we're playing Stratego, for example, right? Actually, Stratego is a very bad example, so let's scratch that from record. But if we're playing like a trading card game, right, where you draw a random hand every turn, you put cards on the table and you play. If you beat me, it's because you got a better draw. You just got lucky, right? I have no way of actually knowing that information's all hidden to me. But if I won, it's pure skill because there's some luck in it, but I made the best use of the luck that I was given, right? If you're playing a classic miniatures game or with little dudes on a map, and I may have made all the correct decisions, but a die roll might have inadvertently hurt me, then of course I can just, that's my out. I can blame it on the die roll. Even if it turns out, in actuality, that particular die roll didn't swing the game in my favor, I can still blame it on that. You won the game because that die roll was critical, and the game is complex enough that I can find justification for it. That is very, very important, by the way. I've never designed a game that does not give players enough of an out to justify losing, right? Because one of my operating theories is when you're playing a game, especially a multiplayer game, the net fun of a game, which is the amount of fun had by all players, The net fun you want to have as high as possible, and in competitive games, there's only one winner, and everybody else is a loser, right? Horrible way to put it. Everybody else is a loser. So I actually concentrate when I'm building a game, not so much on the winner, but I concentrate on the loser's experience. Is the game fun to lose as is fun to win, right? So it's not, I try not to be too punishing early on in the game, so like you can make a mistake that's traceable. You can like, oh, 6 moves ago I moved knight to bishop 3, and that's where I screwed up and I lost, right? I suck, I'm gonna feel bad about it all night. Sorry, I actually lost my train of thought here. But luck plus complexity very often can translate into skill, right? Luck also, by the way, another quick point on that. There's 2 types of luck, generally. There's post-decision luck and pre-decision luck. So in a lot of old board games, post-decision luck, you make all your choices, and then there's a random element that determines whether you succeed or not, right? You find that in miniature games, especially Warhammer being the classic example. So you move a guy into position, then you roll to see if you hit them, or you roll to see if you damage them. You've already made all your choices. The dice are then determining your luck. Your decision process is based on what your expected value of all your rolls are. You can make all the right decisions, but then luck can still hurt you. And then there's pre-decision randomness, like for card games, where you're going to draw a bunch of cards randomly, but once you've drawn that, all the game is pure skill. You have to make the best of what you've drawn. Different players have different tolerances for that. I found that a lot of players, especially hardcore players, they can tolerate luck as long as it's pre-decision luck rather than post-decision. Hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that's great.
Next.
What do you recommend for new board game developers, like how to proceed in terms of developing their game?
What would I recommend for new board game developers for developing your game? So the easy answer is playtest, playtest, playtest. The more detailed answer is playtest, 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 playtest. You can't playtest your game enough, and playtesting is actually a part of the design process. In my opinion, it needs a lot more respect than it currently gets. But playtest does not mean it means play with your friends, play with your gaming group, but it means play outside your gaming group as often as you possibly can. Play with people who have no idea who you are, that you designed the game. One of the tricks I use, by the way, I share this every year, I will often go into a game store and I'll take one of my little game prototypes and I'll go in and I say, hey, one of my friends designed this cool game. Well, I would try not to say cool games, that's pretty low, but one of my friends designed this game, I want to see if it's any good, you guys want to try? That way I'm at the table, I get to observe people's reactions, but nobody knows it was my game. Because if they know it's your game, they're going to be nicer to you. They just are, right? That's how we work. But if they don't know it's you, you'll get honest reactions, and that's what you want, right? You want people to be honest. You want people to be brutal. And if you're sometimes the game just isn't any good, and you have to start over, and you want to find that out. I recommend playtesting with at least, especially if you're a first-time developer, find at least 3 to 5 different groups, completely different. Ideally, not even in the same city if you can handle it. And I would recommend being on hand. Like I know some people recommend playing with outside playtesters, like online and stuff. I don't actually find that useful unless it's just for statistical analysis. But you can just run most statistical analysis you can run on a spreadsheet now. You want to be there. You want to be there personally to observe what people's reactions are, look at their body language. It's pretty obvious when somebody's having fun, regardless of what they say. Because if you get people's feedback verbally, without having seen them play, it's very often totally different from their actual experience. I find this all the time, right? I'll play a game, I'll see somebody's having really a lot of difficulty with the combat system. They keep forgetting what the rule is. They keep forgetting what to do. And at the end of the game, they'll be, yeah, that was fun. I love the combat system, right? But they were totally having difficulty with it. They just remember something in the game later will change their experience, and then they'll editorialize it, right? In playtest, hindsight is exactly not 20/20. So you have to be there to see it and take lots and lots and lots of notes. There's more, but for now, before reaching a publisher, just concentrate on playtesting, concentrate on like through trial and error, learn what feedback to take, what feedback not to take. Everybody has an opinion on their game, everybody. Many of them are valid, and everybody's opinion should be heard. But of course, if you put 10 smart game players in a room and ask for an opinion, you're going to get 10 different opinions, and many of them will be contradictory. You'll get people who you have very, very clearly actionable feedback, right? Like, well, this part of the game is broken. It actually physically does not work. Or this faction-based war game, this faction is winning 10 games out of 12, right? They're clearly too powerful somehow. That's actionable. Well, this spy game is a little bit too short. I think it would be cooler if you had like spaceship combat in it and stuff like that. Instead, that's feedback. It's viable. It's valid feedback, but it's if that's not the game you're making, there's nothing actionable about it. Now, those are two extremes, right? Most feedback you're going to get is right in the middle, and it takes time. It takes some time to hone that. I would recommend for your first game, if you can, spend at least a year just playtesting it. Just playtest, iterate, playtest, iterate, playtest, iterate. Take it to a designer. I'll be here at the show. I'm happy to look at some prototypes. With the understanding, of course, just know that there's a very good chance I'm working on a game that might be using some element that's in common. It happens. I have no interest in ripping off anybody's ideas. I got way too many ideas of my own, so don't worry about that. But like, playing with game designers is a pretty good way to get some like brutal experience feedback too. I played with several game designers at some point, like when I was starting out, and I actually remember one specific one where I played a card game. I met Richard Garfield, who's the creator of Magic the Gathering, about 16 years ago. And I asked him if he wanted to try this awesome game I had. It was the best thing, it was the best little card game ever made. He played it, and he broke it in like 10 seconds. I've been playing this game for months with different groups. He just looked at some of the cards, put it down, and it's like, yeah, these, he just looked, it's like, yeah, the way you did combat in this game actually doesn't work most of the time because reasons. And it just exploded. I was like, but that completely changed the way I looked at how the game development process worked. It opened my mind to looking at my game beyond the way, trying to play the game beyond the way that I intended.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to continue going clockwise.
I'll be the Kickstarter guy.
Kickstarter guy.
Yeah. Are there any games or game mechanics you've seen on Kickstarter so far that have kind of wowed you or kind of surprised they haven't been in more popular games that have been published?
That's a good question. So the question was any mechanics or game ideas I've seen on Kickstarter that wowed me. Short answer, yes. Long answer, may not necessarily be from one particular game. So for example, I've been doing this for a long time, of course, so like, besides the number of games I've made, I've got prototypes and like files for hundreds more, right? And I talk to other designers all the time. So there's many games that come out now that we've discussed at some point, like we should do this kind of game. So there's not only a huge amount of surprises there. Most of the surprises for me happen when I see an idea that we've been talking about that looks like, oh wow, this actually works, or they attack this a different way. One great example is Cryptozoic's Hex MMO TCG that came out. It's a massively multiplayer online trading card game. Say that 5 times fast. On iOS. And I was looking at the way they combine the two. I'm not 100% sure it works. I know it works. It functions. I'm not 100% sure it's going to be as awesome as it could be, like as they say it's going to be, but based on the discussions that I've had with our designer, that's a holy grail, right? A massively multiplayer online game where you're spending most of your time playing little instances of strategy games, where you're not just worrying about grinding, hitting 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 4 for hours and hours and hours. That's really compelling, and if they pull that off, that's going to change. Like that's a whole new market. I hope they do. I really do, because I want to make a game just like that. As for board games, I have to admit, I see so many of them, it's kind of a blur. Yeah, I'll tell you what, I'll get back to you on that one. As we get more questions, I will get back to you on that. Like, sure, right now, I'm not sure. I haven't seen any particular, like, wow, that's the most amazing mechanic I've ever seen. But I've seen a lot of, what did surprise me is the level of professionalism that I've seen in a lot of amateur Kickstarter. There was a game called Zia, Legends of a Drift System, that funded for like $120,000. That was that game could have easily been a professionally published game. I don't think that designer's ever done a game before. It flowed really well, it was really, really tight. I read the rules, I couldn't find any fault with it. Like, it just looked good, it looked really, really solid. It actually looked a lot of fun, I backed it. I thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah, going back to mechanics and trading card games, how far do you go in terms of complexity and depth without getting too complicated? Because I know a lot of people these days have short attention spans, so they don't want to worry about learning about every single rule and every single depth. Like, how far should you go in terms of depth and complexity without making it too complicated?
Trading card games and complexity. Great question. So the short answer is always go simpler. Doesn't matter how simple you think. Especially this is a truism for all games, but it's especially true for trading card games. No matter how simple you think your game is, it's way more complicated than that. Way more complicated. So the second part of that question is, again, it's target audience, right? If you're doing a kids TCG, the rules should be as simple as possible, but not so simple that they're abstract and difficult to understand. So what I mean specifically, there was a great game by a great designer called Garbage Pail Kids, way back when. I don't know, has anybody heard of that? Wow! Sorry, not Garbage Pail Kids necessarily the cartoon, but I mean the trading card game. Very well. So that game, that didn't do too well. It was very, very elegant, right? It had one stat. Every card had one stat that represented 3 different things depending on which game state you were in. It was like, as a game designer, I'm looking at that like, wow, that's so elegant, right? Like he built a marble house out of like tiny little matches, right? But it was really abstract. There was no intuitive hook, right? Like if you're playing, for example, Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering, all creatures have 2 stats, a power and toughness. I deal this much damage, I can take this much damage, right? It's a little bit more complicated, but you explain that once, you'll never explain it again, right? It's very, very easy for people to understand. I would say, like, for rules, complexity, like intuitive complexity is a little bit more, intuitive simplicity is a little bit more important than mechanical simplicity. For cards, the easy answer is word count, right? Try to keep the number of words on a card down as much as possible. Try to keep your font size as big as you can. When I'm designing cards for any type of game, I always start with 12-point font. Always. It doesn't matter how big the font actually is. If you guys have used Microsoft Word, like 12-point font is huge. But it's a discipline, right? It does not allow you to entertain ridiculous, crazy ideas where you want to put every single idea you've ever had into a card because it sounds cool. You have to use the minimum number of rules to evoke the mechanic, to evoke the feeling that you want, or to evoke the play pattern that you want out of that game. It's not just word count though, right? Like, try to avoid cards that create complex game states. So if I have a card, for example, a great example is many trading card games are about I put dudes from my hand onto the table, and our dudes fight, and we kill each other, and points are made somehow or lost. Most of the dudes you put on table have stats, right? It's like damage stat or health stat or any variation, armor or whatever it may be. Cards that add to others, that add to other cards. So I call them virtual stats, right? So like if you have a guy that says, while this guy is in play, all of your other guys get +1 blah. That card is as complicated, gets more complicated for every other card on the table. So it may not have too many words on it, but it increases the game state, the game complexity for every other card that exists. So that card, I would actually consider cards like that to be really, really complex. And for kids games, try to avoid that as much as possible. Try to avoid mechanics that don't push the game forward. right, that stall the game instead of like, for example, if it's a game about, trying to deal damage to your opponent, X number of damage to your opponent, or they lose, try to avoid games that erase damage that you've already done, right? Gain life. Use them, just don't make them more powerful than the mechanics that actually push the game toward the end. Because that makes the game last longer, which means the game can add more complexity. Try to minimize the power level of cards or abilities that create more complexity. Cards that make more cards, that make token creatures, that get more cards into play quickly. Make sure that that doesn't always outweigh card abilities of other cards' abilities to remove that from the table. It's all about like just you almost have to evaluate it case by case, but just try to keep the game. The overarching statement is just try to keep the game moving forward. Now I deliberately avoided saying which mechanics should I use, which mechanics should I not use, because I think the philosophy is more important than the mechanics themselves. Mechanics are completely agnostic. They're not necessarily complex in and of themselves, and they're not necessarily desirable in and of themselves. A game is always the sum of what the mechanics do together. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps.
Okay. All right. You've been waiting patiently. I will get back to you, promise.
I'm deaf-blind, so that's why I have a hard time with the putting my hand in it.
No problem.
My question has to do with accessibility.
Accessibility.
For the board games. For example, you did mention one of the reasons to avoid a situation where everybody's talking is because they're not necessarily going to use strategy. In my case, I'm trying to avoid a situation where everyone's talking because I might not be able to hear them.
Right.
So I just wanted to ask you about what kinds of things to build in with accessibility, with regards to accessibility for different kinds of players.
That's a great question. So,
and sorry, one other thing was that, would it be okay to adapt a board game, like Monopoly, if we were to talk about Monopoly, would it be okay to just try and adapt what is given to you to try and make that more accessible? For example, because I'm colorblind, so I have a hard time telling the difference between blue and green.
Right.
So maybe I would write it on the card or something that it's a blue card or a green card.
right. So two great questions. So I'll split them in two. So the first question is how to make games accessible for a broader audience. So not necessarily just for like casual competitive or age, but also for different types of, put all under the umbrella of disabilities, which could be learning disabilities, could be sensory disabilities, it could be through social disabilities. It's a great question. I'm going to have a complex answer for that. The second one is how to treat what I call UI design, user interface design for board games, also to make it more accessible for specifically colorblindness. I'll start that one first because it's simpler. I don't know if there was a stat passed around a few years ago, and it was the Coast Conference, where they said something, it was crazy to me, but apparently it's true, that I think it was 22% of all gamers are colorblind in some way. Of different types, right? There's to some degree. Some are red-green colorblind, which is the most common one. It's crazy, right? That number sounds totally crazy. Then I found out I'm actually somewhat colorblind. I had no idea, but I'm very likely colorblind. And so one of the things that we don't respect that enough, I think, but we're getting there. One of the easiest ways to do is just assume. When you're putting together a game, just assume everybody's colorblind. Everybody. That'll help a lot. Like, so when I'm putting, like, for example, if I have two cards and it matters in game that they're different types, don't make one red, make one green. Like, do it, but also change the pattern in the back. Make one of the background pattern cross-hatching in one and circles in the other. I actually use the rule of 3. Make sure that there's always 3 ways to distinguish different cards. It might seem redundant to some people, but it shouldn't be. Like, the point of the game shouldn't be trying to figure out what the pieces actually do. I work with card games a lot, and I'm actually, graphic designers kind of hate working with me because of this, but I would say, like, if there are not 3 different ways to distinguish, then back to the drawing board and do it again. So if we have different card types, right, this is a creature card, this is an equipment card or something, I'll make sure, like, all right, The color can be different, sure, but the shape should be different. So like maybe the text box is a little bit raised, maybe the text box is like slightly more triangular or something like that. And number 3, like there's a pattern somewhere, right? Those are just examples, right? Sometimes I put the name of the card in a different shape. I put, sometimes I swap like the art and the art and the card type might be on opposite sides of the card. I do that with board games too, right? Especially Monopoly. So like if I was doing Monopoly, that's a great question. So they don't necessarily have names, but like for the blue roll for Park Place and Boardwalk, I would actually write. I would put in like relief printing behind it. I'd put in like Rich Man's Alley, right? Like I just write it in there so you can see. And it wouldn't interfere with the color, right? It would just be like a treatment. And then anybody who looks at it would just be like, oh, all right, I'm going to go to Rich Man's Alley. And the cool thing about that is that actually gives, that extra name gives people a mnemonic device for that part of the board, right? It's like, oh, I don't know how to tell them Rich Man's Alley. Look at me, right? That's one of the ways I would deal with it. How to make board games accessible for a wider audience, period. The unfortunate answer is there really? Oh. The unfortunate answer is you can't. That's the short answer. I would just have to say, you have to choose at one point. Sometimes you're going to have to choose your limitations and be okay with them. So for example, if it's a party game, a great party game we just played recently, Reverse Charades. I don't know if you guys have ever played it. It is literally reverse charades. It's one person guessing and the rest of the group giving clues. It's awesome. You should get it. It sounds crazy, but I played it once and I sold. That game, for example, like that. So, if somebody asked me like, "Would you make that game for the blind?" I'd say, "I can't. You simply can't." However, for a board game, if I was, I actually I did a board game a couple of years ago with Little Guys on a Map. Did not get published. It may be at some other point. Little Guys on a Map was vaguely Viking-esque themed, and somebody was asking me, it's like, well, like, what if I had limited sight, right? What if one of the people in our group had very, very limited sight. He was like 60% blind. All I did, that actually gave me the idea to make the different parts of the board in relief. So it's easy, really, really easy to just do a touch test on the board. And of course, the miniatures in the game, I replaced my little meeples, little wooden guys, with miniatures with different weapons and stuff, and made sure that the weapons on the figure mattered for would tell you something about their stats. And the funny thing about that was, by making all those changes to the game itself became much easier to play because it was much more visually accessible. And even for the people that weren't sight impaired, it was just like you could now tell. You could tell instantly. You could read the board very quickly, and the game state would explain itself, which is really, to me, that's a huge win. So I guess, so to condense that, the short answer is you probably can't make a game appeal to everybody, of course. But sometimes having, like, I actually try very hard to have people with different skill levels and different ability levels come play my game, because by thinking about those, I can actually make improvements to the game for everybody because of that. Another example is I have some friends with 2 autistic kids, incredibly smart, the smartest kids I've ever met. They have great trouble with sensory overload. So I've actually softened a couple of game prototypes to not be as, I've softened the graphic design of the boards to not make them as loud and as difficult, and it just made the game better for everybody. Right? And I wouldn't have considered that, really, if I wasn't playing with those 2 kids. I am being told I've got 5 minutes left. Really? All right, let's min-max that a little bit. Are you sure it's not 12:45 to 1:45? And she's gone. All right, I have a question real quick.
I just wanted to ask, I'm not sure if this is a common term, but king making as a mechanic.
King making?
Yes, we can basically check the player and knock them down.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that as something that can be worth including as a mechanic, or is it something to be minimized? And if so, how do you go about doing that?
So he asked about king making. So king making is it's a phenomenon. It's a part of board games where if there's enough interaction in a game, you can end up with a situation in which multiple people are playing, and if you can't win, you can help decide who wins through your actions, right? So if there's 3 people playing, one of them is in the lead and the other, the guy in second, you could help the guy in second by beating up, using all your resources on the guy in first, because you don't care, you're not going to win. And you can make the guy in second win because of that. So king making, I would never ever put anything in a game to aid king making, because that just comes naturally. The more open-ended interaction, the more that you're allowed to interact with players and directly remove their pieces or by influence their position on the board, the more that exists, the more king making will just naturally come. If you take interaction away, king making goes down. There's almost an inverse relationship there. So a lot of modern Euro games like Dominion and games like Agricola or something where you play on your own board, right, where all your developments happen on your own board, you don't necessarily, you can make some king-making decisions, but not a lot, right? However, there's a downside to that, right? Some people don't consider those games very interactive, some consider multiplayer solitaire. I don't, but the interaction is very subtle, and some people don't like that. I'm about to be chased out, so. So the short answer is I would never add mechanics for king making. The only thing I would consider when I'm putting together a game is how. Whoa.
Is that better?
Yeah.
That's awesome. Now I gotta go.
Where were you?
Yeah, where were you?
Thank you. And goodbye. The only thing I would consider is how would I mitigate king making, and really is the question is when I'm designing a game is what kinds of interaction am I okay with removing in order to fix king making, and it's never an easy answer. I gave you lots of examples, but I probably have to do it in private since we're almost done. Do we have any other burning questions that I did not get to? At the door. We're done in 5 minutes. That's the answer.
What is your view on making a game so that you can have it specifically set to be easier, medium, or hard? So the game will last 10 turns, 20 turns, 30 turns, or you have different amounts of starting resource.
So the question is variable difficulty, right? Like how do you feel about having variable levels of difficulty or complexity in a game? It can work. I've seen many games, including Super Secret Game here, has an easy mode and a hard mode, where if the game is playable with only a small, with a subsection of its mechanics, you can call that the easy mode, and then add a bunch of stuff as seamlessly as possible and make it harder. I think that's cool. It's not for every game, because I found most often if I have games with varying levels of complexity, if the game is really as playable in easy mode as in hard mode, and if it's still interesting and elegant and challenging, I usually just get rid of the other modes, because clearly those aren't needed. Now in cooperative games where all players play against the board and everybody wins or loses together, I think very highly of multiple levels of difficulty. I think most good cooperative games do have multiple levels of difficulty. For a quick recommendation, I will recommend Pandemic. If you guys haven't played it, Pandemic is awesome. Play it on easy mode to start. If you guys like games that just hate you and want to punish you from beginning to end, Antoine Bauza made a great game called Ghost Stories. Yeah. Anybody beat that game ever? Yeah, I did on easy mode once. It's fun though. If you want to see how difficult it can be to beat a game, even if all of you guys are smart and make the correct decisions, that's a good game. Arkham Horror by Fantasy Flight is a long game about the Cthulhu mythos where you guys are trying to close down gates before the great old one comes in. It's pretty complicated, can last several hours, but it almost feels like a role-playing game in board game form. That game has various degrees of difficulty, but it's in a weird tangential way. That's in how many expansions you decide to add. Every expansion ups the difficulty by a little bit. So if you play the base game, it can actually be a little bit easy. you add Kingsport, and you may never win again. But that's how it goes. Am I kicked out? Are we done? All right. Well, thank you very much, guys.